So now we'll be running Arthur Young, and he'll be speaking on understanding forensic genealogy. Thank you.
Mr. Arthur Young earned his Bachelor of Science in Pre-Medical Sciences from the University of Southwestern Louisiana in 1991, now the University of Louisiana at Lafayette, with interest in human anatomy, physiology, and biochemistry. His training includes the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Serological Research Institute, and the McCone Research Institute. His approach to casework is as an investigative scientist, and that every case can be solved. His personal interests have been useful in casework, which includes the area of cooking, photography, psychology, anthropology, engineering, and architecture. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Arthur Young.
Good morning or good afternoon to everybody, wherever you are. Thank you for attending my lecture. Let's go ahead and get started here. All right. I will be speaking about understanding forensic genealogy today. We've seen a lot of this in forensic DNA analysis. It's a fairly hot topic, and it's been very helpful in solving a lot of cases. Next slide, please. Basically, there are two particular areas that we'll be discussing today. I'll give you several case examples of how forensic genealogy works, and then we'll get into some of the legal issues that surround forensic genealogy. Next. Next. All right, so first of all, what is it? Next. The International Society of Genetic Genealogy has a definition that says it's a term used particularly in the United States to describe genealogical research, analysis, and reporting in cases with legal implications, often involving living individuals. Generally speaking, genealogy is the research of family history. It can involve mostly delving into records, birth records, church records, legal records. However, the application of genetics has allowed us to go even farther back than that. Next. So on their website, they give several examples of forensic genealogy's applications. However, in the laboratory, there are certain ones that are common. Next. The first one is the military repatriation of remains. A soldier's remains can be returned to the family once they've been identified. This is the one that I most commonly deal with, as well as the repatriation of regular remains, not just military. Next. Such as assisting coroner's offices in identifying relatives of unclaimed remains, like so. Next. There's an alternative definition, and that's analyzing DNA test results to study both matches and non-matches, as well as estimating one's most recent common ancestor. In other words, finding how far back you and another individual share a common ancestor. Next. So very quickly, the analysis process, if we have a shirt. Next. And let's say the shirt has a blood stain. We will then take a sample from that blood stain and extract the DNA. Next. Analyze the DNA. Next. Take those results, enter it into a database. Next. Next. And hopefully find a particular individual. So a case that we will take a look at is the Grim Sleeper, as Dr. Mike Coble mentioned yesterday. Next. So the first case to be solved by forensic genealogy was that of the Grim Sleeper. It happened from 1985 to 1988. And then there was a 14-year lag, resuming again in 2002 to 2007. There were numerous unsolved murders of young black women in the Los Angeles area. Most of them were prostitutes. He was originally dubbed the South Side Slayer, which was then changed to the Grim Sleeper when he resumed his murders after 14 years. Next. However, what's actually suspected is that he was still active in this period of time. It's just that the victims' bodies have never been found. Next. Police and law enforcement officials had taken extensive steps to try and identify this person, from offering rewards of $500,000 to pleading for assistance from the public with any sort of leads. Now, DNA from saliva from one of the victims had produced a male profile, yet searches through federal and state databases yielded no matches. Investigators modified their search for DNA profiles that were similar to, but not identical to, that of the unknown profile. And what they found was that the database had a hit to Christopher Franklin, but it was not an exact match. As Mike mentioned yesterday, Christopher Franklin had been apprehended for felony possession of a firearm. However, he was required to submit a DNA sample, and that is the sample that produced the hit. The scientists, however, noted that Christopher's DNA profile was very similar to that of the Grim Sleeper, but in a very, very particular way. Next. So, if you recall from high school biology, we have something called a Punnett square. It looks like a tic-tac-toe grid, and across the top we will put the one parent, let's say the mother, and across the left column we'll put the father, X and Y. Now, if the mother forwards her red X and the father forwards his green X, next, what we have are two X's that the child will inherit, and what you have is a daughter. However, if the father passes on his white Y chromosome forward, next, what we have is a son. And then what we have, if the mother instead of the red X gives the pink X, then there will be a daughter. Next. Otherwise, if the father contributes his Y chromosome, there will be a son. Now, these are the 4 genetic possibilities for any child. But you will note, next, if the child has 2 X's, there's going to be a daughter. Next. But if the child has an X and a Y chromosome, then it's going to be a son. These are these are the 4 genetic possibilities, but there are only 2 physical possibilities, a son or a daughter. Next. So let's take a look at a family tree then. Here we have 2 gummy bears, a yellow one and a red one. And if they have 2 cubs, they're going to produce, they're each going to contribute half of their DNA to each child. Next. So children always get half of their DNA from their mother and half from their father. However, it's not always the same half that each child receives. So let's say that one of the bears meets a nice little green bear, and they have several cubs of their own. And you'll note that each cub gets 1/4 of the yellow bear, 1/4 of the red bear, but half of the green. Next. And that's because each bear gets half from mom and half from dad. It's just that the half that comes from from the yellow-red bear just varies. So one of our bears, one of our cubs, meets an orange bear, and they go and have several cubs of their own. And again, you'll notice that each child, each cub, has half an orange bear, which came from one parent, but the other half is now broken down. It's fractions of the others. Next. So this rule is always the same. It's half from the mom and half from the dad. Next. So let's take a look at a DNA profile. And this is a, next slide, next, please. Example number 1, we have 2 parents, and let's say that our scenario is this. A child is murdered, and the remains are found several days later. And so they might be, number 1, they might be decomposed beyond recognition. They might be instead burned beyond recognition. Or another possibility is that they could be incomplete. They might be just simply an arm or a leg that is found. However, in this case, we have DNA samples from both parents that are provided. So let's take a look at how this process happens. The remains, there's an X chromosome here at the genetic marker amylogenin, and that would have come from the mother. The Y chromosome would have come from the father. So we would know that these remains are that of a male. Next. So we see that the child's remains also has a 17 at the genetic marker D3S1358, which could have come from the mother. But since there's only one allele here, that 17 also has to come from the father. So we compare that against the father of the missing child. And yes, the father has one. Next. The 11 allele could have come from the mother. The 16 allele could have come from the father. At the next genetic marker, there's a 12 and a 14, and that could have come from either one of those could have come from the mother. We just don't know which one the mother gave. However, when we look at the father has a 14 allele, in which case that we would use that the father gave the 14 and the 12 came from the mother. Now, keep in mind, we don't actually know that this is true. We instead are inferring from the parents that that's what would have happened if this was the child. Next. At the next genetic marker, we have a 14, and the mother has a 14. There's also a 12 at this next genetic marker, which the father has. At the next genetic marker, we have an 11, which the mother has. And since that's the only allele that these remains produced, the father would have to have an 11 as well, and our father does have an 11. At the next genetic marker, we have a 13 and a 17. The 17 could have come from the mother, which means that the 13 would have come from the father. And if we continue this throughout all of the data, we'll see the ones that could have come from the mother, and we'll see the alleles that could have come from the father. Next. All right, and I want you to pay particular attention to this particular allele here, and this is DYS391. DYS391 is a genetic marker that looks at a sequence that occurs on the Y chromosome. So therefore, the mother, since she doesn't have a Y chromosome, she does not produce any results here. The 10 that was detected would have come from the Y chromosome that the child inherited from the father, and this father does in fact have a 10. So that part is consistent as well. Next. So if we look at the same situation, instead, however, we only have one parent to look at. Scroll through, please. And basically the same case scenario exists. Next. And we go through the data. However, go ahead and scroll through these, please. All right, so as we go through this, you'll notice that since we only have one parent to compare, we don't actually know which allele came from the mother versus the father. However, what we are seeing is consistency. In certain places like D2S441, which is the fourth row from the top, the child has a 12 and a 14, and the mother has a 12 and a 14, and we don't know which one would have come from her because either one of them could have come from her. However, only one of them could have come from her. We see about 2/3 of the way down, D5S818, another instance where the remains produced a 12-13 and the mother has a 12-13. Either one of those could have come from her, but only one of them could have come from her. Next slide, please. So let's consider another case. This is an incest case. And here we had a woman who claims that she was attending a family gathering for the holidays, and she became intoxicated. She awakens the next day in bed, still clothed, but with no particular memory of how she got there. She believes that she was sexually assaulted, but no one in the family will believe her. So 2 months later, however, she learns that she's pregnant. So now a DNA sample is taken from her two brothers, and a sample is taken from the child, whether it be through a DNA sample taken in vivo, during something like amniocentesis for genetic testing, or if a sample is taken when the baby's born. So regardless, the child produces an X and a Y, and so the X would have come from the mother, and the Y could have come from, well, the Y would have come from the father, but the question is, which brother did it come from? I've color-coded brother number 1 as blue, and I've color-coded brother number 2 as green. And the Y chromosome could have come from either one of them because they both have the Y chromosome. Next, we have the 15 and the 18 alleles, which the mother has both. However, when we look at brother number 1, he only has the 15. So the 15 could have come from him, in which case the 18 would have come from the mother. However, brother number 2 has both 15 and 18, and he could have contributed either one. So this is all still consistent. We don't know which brother it is, and we don't know which allele the mother provided. So next, we have the 16 allele that the child has, and that means that the father also has to have the 16. But as we see, brother number 1 and brother number 2 both have 16s. So on to the next genetic marker. The child has an 11 and an 11.3, which both children have. I'm sorry, which the mother has both. However, brother number 1 only has the 11, and brother number 2 only has the 11.3. So again, we don't know which one it is because we can't tell which one came from the mother. At the next genetic marker, the child has a 15, which is the only allele that the mother has. However, brother number 1 only has the 15 as well, and brother number 2 also has a 15. On to the next genetic marker, 11 and 14. Well, here the 14 could only have come from the mother because the other allele that she has is the 13. which means that the 11 has to come from the father. Unfortunately, both brother number 1 and brother number 2 have the 11 allele. Next marker, 11, 12. Mom has both of them. And in this particular case, the brother number 1 and brother number 2 both only have the 12, which means that the 11 could only have come from the mother, but we don't know which brother has the 12. And if we continue and do this for all of the data, we basically find ourselves in the same sort of situation, and we have numerous overlapping alleles between brother number 1 and brother number 2. However, there is one thing, and that is, next slide, please, right here. At D2S1338, brother number 1 has a 17, which the child does not have. So at this particular point in time, we would conclude that brother number 2 is the one who fathered the child. Next slide, please. So when every person is born, something that we all need to remember is that the DNA that they inherit becomes theirs. It's now your DNA, and half will be passed on to the child, but that doesn't mean that 25% came from each grandparent to the child. It's normally around there. Next slide, please. So I had to do a little bit of digging to find some of these images off the internet. This is a 1 naira note, which is the national currency of Nigeria. And a single naira is comprised of 100 kobo. And for those of you who are not familiar with this unit of currency, a kobo is similar to the American penny. There are 100 of them to the naira. However, the naira has become so demonetized, if you will, that the kobo is basically obsolete. It has no particular value these days at all. So just as there are 100 kobo to the naira, we can't break down any further than this. So if you were to get 50 kobo from your mother and 50 kobo from your father, you would now have 100 kobo. And when you have a child, you will give 50 of those to your children. However, it is not necessarily that you pass on 25 from your mother and 25 from your father. It's generally around there. Now, when that child has a child of their own, basically the same thing happens. But what I'm trying to denote here is that genes and alleles are discrete units, which means that by the time you get to great-great-great-grandchildren, there is not going to be a fraction of a kobo. Instead, what you're going to see is a kobo that came from you or didn't come from you. So that is the discreteness of the alleles. You only have 2, and where you got them from and whether you pass it on is going to depend on purely chance, really. So there's only so far that we can go by using alleles, which is what the STR DNA system uses. Next slide. So back to the Grim Sleeper. Christopher Franklin was born in August of 1981, so he only would have been 4 years old at the time of the first murder in 1985. Therefore, it couldn't be him, but it also couldn't be any of his sons because he was only 4 years old at the time, which means that it could only have been his father. Next slide. So a DNA sample was surreptitiously obtained from the father. He was followed, and as Mike mentioned yesterday, it was taken from various utensils that he used at a pizza joint, and that includes the pizza itself. Next. And that DNA was an exact match. Next. So the father, Lonnie Franklin Jr., he actually could have been caught in 2004. However, when he was on, he could have been caught in 2004 when he was on parole for a felony conviction. However, parole officers were not equipped or trained in collecting DNA samples from parolees at that time. Even though, next, Mr. Franklin had numerous run-ins with the law. Next. And the really sad news then is that Ayala Marshall, who was reported missing in February of 2005, also, next, Rolenia Morris was reported missing in September of 2005, next, and Janisha Peters was reported missing in 2007. If that DNA sample had been collected from Mr. Franklin at that time in 2004, these women would probably still be alive today. In other words, their murders could have been avoided. Next. Next case we'll take a look at is that of the Golden State Killer. And in this particular case, next, he was apprehended in 2018. And this was decades after murdering his last victim. Next. So here we have a timeline, and the first victim in December of 1975. Next. I'm sorry, September of 1975 is Claude Snelling. In February of 1978, two people were murdered. Brian Maggiore and Kate Maggiore. In December of 1979, Robert Offerman and Alexandria Manning were murdered. Next, in March of 1980, Lyman and Charlene Smith were both murdered. In August of 1980, Keith and Patrice Harrington. In February of 1981, Manuela, I think that's Whithune, was murdered. In July of 1981, Gregory Sanchez and Sherry Domingo were both murdered. And the last one was in May of 1986, and that was Janelle Cruz. Now, the one that was of particular interest was this one, Charlene Smith. And that was because, next slide, please. And that was because of this man. In 1980, Dr. Peter Speth was an assistant medical examiner in Ventura County, and he had examined the body of Charlene Smith. It was common practice for medical examiners to collect vaginal samples in the event of sexual assault so that the crime lab could identify and analyze semen that was recovered. That practice was observed in this case. However, it was also Dr. Speth's practice to collect a second kit, and that kit remained at the bottom of a freezer for almost 40 years. Next. So that was how the Golden State Killer was apprehended. The DNA was analyzed and run through a database looking for a family member. But this process is not perfect. In fact, what very few people are aware of is that the first person that was approached in the case was actually the wrong man. In 2018, an Oregon police officer was convinced to approach a judge to get a warrant to obtain a DNA sample from a 73-year-old man who was living in a assisted care facility. And they wanted to test his DNA to see if he might be the Golden State Killer. However, the DNA did not match. The elderly man's daughter became aware of this after the sample had been taken. And she was, as you might imagine, outraged at this violation of her father's rights. However, when she was told what its purpose was, she actually helped the police determine who it could have been. So it had to have been someone who was related. It had to have been someone who was the right age. But it would also have to be someone who was living in California at the time. So what they had was the right family. They just had the wrong member of the family. Next. All right, so let's follow some DNA. Here we have an egg that is about to be fertilized by a sperm. And inside the egg, there is the DNA from the mother, what we call the nuclear DNA, but there is also mitochondria. And you might remember mitochondria as the quote-unquote powerhouse of the cell. It has its own DNA because it is its own primitive living organism. Meanwhile, the sperm only contributes the nuclear DNA, or the half, his half of the DNA. It can include the Y chromosome if the sperm has one, but there is no mitochondria that is being contributed from the sperm. Next. So here we are looking at a simple family tree. A man and a woman have 4 kids, 2 sons and 2 daughters. And the father is passing on his Y chromosome to his 2 sons, as indicated by the yellow outline. Next. However, the mother, she is contributing her mitochondria to all of her children, which includes the 2 sons and the 2 daughters. Next. So in this extended family tree, what we're going to see is, next, we can see that the mother, well, let's start with the father on the left side of the screen. He received his Y chromosome from his father, and his father got it from his father. So the Y chromosome passes from father to son to grandson to great-grandsons. Meanwhile, on the right side of the screen, we have the mitochondria. The mother gave it to her 4 children. However, she got her mitochondria from her mother, who got it from her mother. So if you'll notice over on the left side of the screen, the father's mother has a okay. So the father's mother has a blue outline around her, but because she only had a son, her mitochondria ended with her. Her lineage stops with her, and it only continues if she has some other ancestor somewhere else in the world. Next slide, please. All right. So with forensic genealogy, what we're doing is we're looking at a particular family. We're looking for a particular person. Next. Next. So from DNA analysis, we would know that this particular person comes from this particular lineage, a light blue mitochondrial DNA. However, the YSTRs, next, is coming from a green YSTR family line, and so this is what we're trying to find, someone who intersects at these 2 lineages. So this person would have to have the correct maternal ancestor as well as the correct paternal ancestor. But then we also have to look at the age, the projected birth year, about how old would this person have been at the time and how old they would be today. We would also have to factor in siblings, because any brother or sister would, well, actually just a brother would have the same lineage as the person that we're looking for. which we would have to determine by the age of the mother, if she was old enough to bear children, and if she actually did have any children at that time. We can also look at records from the Department of Motor Vehicles, school records or church records to try and find that age. Next. This is a map of mitochondrial migration. By looking at population groups around the world, we can basically map out how ancient man traveled across the earth, how he migrated, starting in Africa and then moved north. You can see where at the letter N on the left side of your screen, some people went left into Europe, and some people went right into Asia. Next. Okay, so we're now going to take a look at some other applications of forensic genealogy. There we have Ancestry. Health editor Christine Solomon took a DNA test, and what she learned was that from her own DNA, they were able to determine certain metabolic secrets that were held in her DNA. For example, she's sensitive to caffeine. However, it turns out that she's actually not sensitive to caffeine, not because of her genetics, but because of her lifestyle. Miss Solomon actually consumes quite a bit of caffeine, quite a bit of coffee throughout the day. And because of that, her body is trained to ignore caffeine. She wrote in her article that she can actually drink coffee before going to bed and sleep just fine. They also learned that she needed vitamin D. She had a metabolic deficiency, and so she needed more vitamin D because of an absorption issue. In fact, blood tests showed that the levels were so low that she needed a prescription strength dietary supplement of vitamin D to get back to a normal level. She also metabolizes carbohydrates slower than other people. So when she cut carbs out of her diet, which includes, I think she said, bread, pasta, baked goods, and sweets, she found that she had lost weight almost immediately. Lastly, her DNA indicated that her muscles were better suited for high-intensity activities instead of endurance activities. So she switched her workout to high-intensity high-intensity interval training as opposed to long-distance marathon runs. Next. Another thing you can do with Ancestry DNA is to look at any rare DNA that might be showing up. For example, Doreen Isherwood and Anne Hall are citizens of the UK, and when they took the test, it indicated that they had Native American blood in their ancestry, even though, as far as they knew, none of their ancestors had ever left the UK. Instead, what they learned was that in the 1500s, Native Americans from what would one day be the United States traveled to the UK, and they were either slaves or emissaries or other types of dignitaries, and they settled in the UK, had children, but eventually their lineage had diluted out as far as any features went. However, those traces of their Native American ancestry still resided in their DNA. Next. This story is about the Reverend J. Spates of Rockville, Maryland. He took the DNA test to find out more about his ancestry, and what he found out was that he was actually a descendant of Beninese royalty. And he tried to do some more research, but as it so happens, there was a chance meeting of a priest from Benin who was giving a lecture in New York City. So he went to go meet this contingent, and when he spoke with one of the men turned to him and said, "I know your king. Here is his phone number." Next. So a series of phone calls and emails took place, and Reverend Spates was invited to Benin, where he met with the king, and his descendancy was recognized, and he was named a prince. Next. So Reverend Spates used this particular website, DNA Tested African Descendants, and this particular website assists individuals trying to find more about their African ancestry. Next slide, please. All right. Long lost relatives. Matt Henninger always knew that he was adopted. However, the records were closed, and so he wasn't able to find out a whole lot, but he did take a DNA test. Joyce Bergener, however, she loved genealogy, and she also she worked for the church, and she helped others find long-lost relatives. And when Ancestry.com notified her of a possible first cousin, she was intrigued by both her passion and the possibilities, so she reached out to him. And between the two of them, piecing things together, she discovered that he was the baby that her mother gave up for adoption when she was only 12 years old. So this was a long-lost brother. Next slide, please. Here we have close encounters. Here is Tracy Melton, and she was born in LA. She never knew her father, and she had been told that her father had actually died. She moved to Spokane, Washington as a teenager, and she took a DNA test, and she was notified of a parent or child match. Now, obviously, most women are aware of the number of children that they have, and so she had all the children that she was supposed to have, so this could only have been a parent. Ronaldo Delgado was a firefighter in Los Angeles, and when he retired, he and his family moved to Washington, only 12 miles away from Tracy. So, sorry. When Tracy learned about this, they agreed to meet, and she inherited 7 half-siblings that she never knew that she had. Meanwhile, the 7 half learned about a half-sib that they never knew that they had. Next is unraveling adoptions. Neil Schwartzman knew that he was adopted, and he used 23andMe to find his biological relatives. 23andMe linked him to Jolie Pearl as a possible sibling. However, Miss Pearl was never aware that she had a brother. And the reason why was because this was her older brother. She had not been born yet. Her mother had never spoken of this. And when she confronted her mother, the mother admitted, yes, she did have another child, a son, who was born first and was put up for adoption because she was too young at the time. Next. 2 lifelong friends share a secret. We have here Walter McFarlane, and he took a DNA test, and what he discovered was more than he could possibly bargain for. His best friend, Alan Robinson, they've been best friends for 60 years. They played high school football together, and they were actually half-brothers. They were both born in Honolulu, Hawaii, in the mid-1940s, which was about 4 years after Pearl Harbor. He was raised by his grandparents. He did not know his mother, but he then learned that the woman that he called his sister was actually his mother, because she was about 14 at the time. The mother had actually produced another child, which was put up for adoption, and that was Alan. And Alan was adopted by another couple who raised him as their own. But the two just happened to meet in high school because they were about the same age, living in the same geographical area. And so naturally they would cross paths. Next. All right, we have affairs revealed. Paul McGrath was a reporter for the Houston Chronicle, and when he took a DNA test, the man that he thought was his father was actually not. However, that man passed away in the 1990s. His mother lived in an assisted living facility, and she was non-communicative simply because she had suffered several mini strokes and lost the ability of speech. Ancestry DNA told him that Domingo Malaquas was his half-brother, and when the two started communicating and comparing notes, records showed that McGrath's mother and Malaquas's father had a relationship before she married the man that Paul McGrath knew. If you ask me, my suspicion is that she was actually probably seeing both men at the time. All right, next slide is sperm donations. Dr. Bryce Cleary donated sperm as a first-year medical student in the 1990s. He has since learned that his sperm was used to conceive at least 21 children. And these children started meeting each other, started finding each other. Back one slide, please. And that number of children is 19 and counting. Actually, that's an old article. The number of children that have come forward is 21. And there could be even more. What has to happen is that people have to have the DNA test and then find out if they're a match. Next slide, please. Meanwhile, Andrew Torrey was an only child, and he always wished that he had a brother or sister. After taking this at-home DNA test, he learned that he has 30 half-siblings. They all came from the same sperm donor. They have a Facebook page where they get together. Next slide, please. Now, if you think that this might be unusual or a lot, well, there's a British man who's believed to have fathered about 600 children at his own fertility clinic. This was back in the 1970s. There were no laws governing this sort of thing because women and couples were coming to the fertility clinic because of some fertility problem. And at the time, there was no particular research done as to where the sperm were coming from. Now, if you think that's a lot, well, it's perhaps not the record, because the record probably belongs to the other man who was involved at that same clinic, and it's believed that he may have fathered 1,000 children. So this is what the power of today's DNA analysis has brought. Next slide, please. Here we have an interesting case of a woman Lydia Fairchild. She applied for governmental assistance to help raise her 2 children while she was pregnant with a third. However, to qualify, she had to take a DNA test to show that she was actually the mother of these children. But the DNA tests indicated that she was not the mother. In fact, she was probably more the aunt. Fairchild insisted, however, that she did give birth to those 2 children and that she was not trying to defraud the government. So it was arranged that a government representative would witness the birth of the third child and collect a DNA sample for testing. And that one also showed that Fairchild was not the mother, still the aunt, even though that sample was collected from the baby at the time of birth. So what happened here? Next. This is a chimera, and in Greek mythology, the chimera is a monster with the body of a lion, a tail of a snake, and the wings of a dragon, with 2 extra heads, usually a goat and a dragon. Depends on which version you're looking at. So there are human chimeras too, where fraternal twins were born in the womb, however, they fused into a single person. Lydia Fairchild was a chimera, and the ovaries in her body had the DNA of her unborn fraternal twin sister, which would explain why the children that were conceived genetically were that of her nieces and nephews. Next. So let's get into some of the legal issues with the time that we have. Next. So what's legal? Searching the databases is legal because the donors have now opted in to have their DNA searched. Back in 2018, only 3 years ago, there weren't even policies or laws governing that. So anyone could look in the databases for anything. What's not legal now, though, is pretending that an evidentiary sample is a reference sample, as the DNA donor's privacy rights have not been secured. And this happened in the case of the Golden State Killer, where the DNA sample from Charlene Smith was submitted as a reference DNA profile for search purposes. And now that's considered a violation of the terms of service. Next slide. So some of the privacy issues, and this is something that Nigeria and Africa in general will have to deal with each country on their own, because what I've learned is that the right to privacy is almost strictly an American idea. So the privacy issues, if you're interested in taking such a test, is read the fine print. And there will usually be some sort of phrase in there that says, we may transfer our rights and obligations under a contract with you to another organization, but this will not affect your rights or our obligations under these terms. Translation, we can sell your data or your sample or both. So you might want to be careful about what happens to that. A particular example that I can share with you, one research group wanted to see if they could find the gene that would determine whether or not someone is going to be homosexual or not. And so they bought about 600 samples of DNA from individuals who identified themselves as gay. However, this company was not able to find the common link across the 600 samples. Next. And about anonymity. This is in 2018, and an article came out that genomes show no one's DNA is anonymous anymore. In fact, the article went on to reveal that genome hackers with a DNA profile and using publicly available databases can find the person within about 30 minutes. Next slide. So this comes to the end of my talk, and I would like to acknowledge a lot of people. First and foremost is Dr. Richard Somieri for putting on the presentation, for getting all of this together. Ms. Halma Amadi for helping with all of the IT components. And also 2 individuals, the interns that I've had this summer, Ms. Molly Yunker and Ms. Katie Poe. I'd also like to say hi to all of the folks at the LSD and FC. I missed you this year and last year. I hope that next year we'll be able to meet again. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so very much, Ato. Of course, you are part of the LFS, and you've been with LSDFC right from the beginning. So that was an excellent lecture dealing with genealogy. So you're still around. If we have questions, we're going to ask you to please come back on and provide some explanation. So genealogy, how expensive is it for people that might want to take that route to find their lineage?
It depends on who you go with. It can be as cheap as about $75 up to about 130. The thing that you would want to be careful of is how much sample you're being asked to provide. In some cases, they might ask you for a swab from your cheek, and that's fairly innocuous. There's not a lot of DNA there. However, other places will ask you for about a tablespoon or 2 tablespoons of saliva. Well, it doesn't take that much DNA to get a DNA profile. So those are the ones that are probably storing your saliva sample and probably selling it off later. And that's the reason why they're able to do these analyses for so little money.
Okay, and I know you mentioned that do you have to give your consent to opt into those databases? Can they do the test and just release the result just to you without making it part of their database?
Legally, probably not. Most of these, at the time, in the presentations that I gave you, there were no rules, no policies about how this information could be used. Ever since then, however, there has been a huge uproar to establish what those rules can be. So GEDmatch has since implemented the opt-in policy where everyone has to opt in. And so law enforcement can't go in without, well, they can't just go in and dig around to see if they might have a match. Instead, what you would have is they would need a court order to be able to go in and look to see if there is someone there.
Okay, thank you so much, Ato. And hang around in case we have more questions, because that's an area that I know a lot of people are interested in. Thanks for an excellent presentation as always.